Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are taking a look at something that I am really interested in. This is the real-world origins of the Codex Astartes. And when we trace through the history, we actually see that the real-world Codex and the organization it supported was, in a lot of ways, I think, even more awesome and wild than the Space Marines themselves. But before we get started, of course, we are going to look at the Codex Astartes itself. Now, we know that the Codex Astartes is in Warhammer 40,000 lore the book and the set of rules that govern the tactics, organization, strategies, and conduct of the Space Marines. This was written by the Primarch Robute Guilliman to help govern and guide the conduct of the numerous chapters of Space Marines that emerged in the second founding. And it has been more or less successful. It's ensured a somewhat consistent standard of conduct by Space Marine chapters while giving them enough room for flexibility. Though it's worth noting that some Space Marine chapters are extremely Codex compliant, and some Space Marine chapters, like the Black Templars, play fast and loose, and some, of course, they just totally ignore the Codex Astartes altogether, like the Space Wolves here. Now, what is the Codex Astartes? What is its core message about Space Marines? Obviously, we got some excerpts here. You can see that we've got, this which spells out they shall be my finest warriors these men who give themselves to me. I shall mold them in the furnace of war, forge them. Right? That's like the preamble. It sounds pretty cool, pretty hardcore, but it doesn't really tell us anything. But let's see. There's some more stuff here that I think really helps get to the heart of who they think who the Space Marines see themselves as. Right? It says here, they shall be pure of heart and strong of body, unsullied by doubt and untainted by self-aggrandizement. They will be bright stars in the firmament of battle, angels of death under whose wings bring extermination to the enemies of man. So it shall be for 1,000 times 1,000 years, unto the end of eternity and the extinction of mortal flesh. Okay, so we know that this is, again, a statement of ideals about Space Marines, and they're defined by their strength, but also by their humility, and their role as the defenders of humanity against Xenos and chaos, and that their mandate stretches forever because it's a divine mandate. So, what is sort of the real-world examples? Well, first, the earliest example of a codified, there's lots of codified rules of behavior, but the thread that we're going to be tracing is from the Christian monastic orders of the early Middle Ages through our friends, the Knights Templar. I think this is the thread that most strongly connects to the Codex Astartes, and not just because they're all written in Latin. Right? The rule of Saint Benedict, or in Latin, the Regula Sancti Benedicti, was written in 516 AD, and this was by a since canonized Saint Benedict of Nursia, and this was a guide for monks to live and work together in monasteries. Remember, in the Middle Ages, monasteries were hubs not only of knowledge, but they were self-sufficient or largely self-sufficient communities. Almost communes is the best way to think of them, in which every monk contributed as they were best able, almost universally he was best able, and allowed the thriving of the entire community. But it only worked, they found, is if there was a unified sense of not only duty and purpose, but culture. And that's what the rule of St. Benedict sought to do. It sought to create a unified view of how a monastery should be run. So, of course, it's got a preface which, like the Codex Astartes, lays out what constitutes the ideal traits of these monks? Well, it talks here about the renunciation of one's own will and arming oneself with the strong and noble weapons of obedience under the banner of the true King, Christ the Lord. Right? He talks about monks as a school for the Lord's service, and the way to salvation shall be taught, so that preserving the monastery till death, his disciples through patience share in the passion of Christ, that they may deserve also to share his kingdom. So you see here, and it has 73 chapters, so it is an extensive work, but it talks about a range of topics, just like the Codex Astartes, which covers everything from battle tactics to personal conduct. This, too, deals with both routine matters, such as the qualifications of an abbot and the process of eating and praying and when loud conversation can be had. But it also dictates more philosophical principles, like what constitutes a ideal monk. And usually those are things like obedience is a tremendous one, humility, moderation, and they talk about humility being in 12 steps: fear of God, subordination of the will to God, obedient to one's superior, patient amid hardships, confession of sins, accept the meanness of task, and hold oneself as a worthless workman, consider oneself inferior to all, follow examples set by superiors, do not speak until spoken to, do not readily laugh, speak simply and modestly, express one's inward humility through bodily posture. So it's interesting because the Astartes, as warriors, absolutely do not subscribe to this high level of humility. The Codex Astartes doesn't emphasize it. It trades off. It pays homage to the lack of self-aggrandizement, and that's, I think, intrinsic to warfare. Right? You can't love yourself so much that you're unwilling to die for the service of the emperor. But the monasteries and their brothers within it are not bound by such a code. And in fact, having a monastery where humility is so heavily emphasized that it may actually have been a way to prevent factionalization and inter-faction conflict within this monastery. Right? The idea that it was seen as tacky and unbecoming to strive for greater leadership. And again, we look through and we see just a tremendous how monks should behave on a journey, cheerfully do whatever is commanded, forbids monks from defending one another, right? Prohibits them from striking one another. And so this proved to be extremely popular and extremely widespread. Benedictine monks continue to today and follow this exact code, more or less unchanging. What I also thought was really interesting when I first took a look at this was that there are actually 4 kinds of monk that Benedict specified. One is the Cenobites, who in a monastery where they serve under an abbot. You had anchorites or hermits who, after a long successful training in a monastery, are now coping single-handedly with only God for their help. So hermits like living in the woods. There's Cerebates, living 2 and 3 in groups of 2 or 3, or even alone, with no experience, rule, and superior, and thus a law unto themselves, which is pretty wild. And Gyrovages, who were sort of nomads, wandering from one monastery to another. It says slaves to their own wills and appetites. So it sounds like Benedict did not have a high opinion of these sort of vagrant, itinerant monks. Now, of course, you're thinking, Paul, the rule of St. Benedict, while interesting, is not actually a rule or a codex for warriors. Well, that is what is interesting, because fast forward about 500 years, and the peaceful monastic orders are extremely well established. But what is most interesting is that around 1119, we start to see the Crusades. The Pope is starting to realize some of his political ambitions, or a variety of popes are trying to realize their political ambitions, and the well-to-do, the elites of Europe, the secular elites, are also trying to curry favor with the very powerful religious establishment, and so you have the Crusades. And not only that, but you also have, as more and more knights secure and fight to control the Holy Land of Jerusalem and the general Palestine area, you see more and more pilgrims doing pilgrimages to Jerusalem to visit holy sites. But of course, journeying on foot from Europe to Jerusalem is tremendously dangerous. And so much so that it starts to become a political problem for the Pope. And so one of the kings proposes, or a French knight proposes to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, that there be a monastic order created with the express purpose of defending pilgrims from marauders and other dangers while on pilgrimage. So this would be the first time that a independent armed force was raised in the name of religious orders only. Again, there may be other examples, but I believe they are like existing armies that fell under the command of the papacy. So the Knights Templars, of course, were this very, I don't want to say bizarre, but what made them so bizarre is that they were fighting monks, right? This is, of course, the idea that you could have this group of people who lived lives in a monk-like way, like the Benedictines, but remember, the Benedictines couldn't even fight each other. They couldn't even stand up for one another, right? They couldn't even defend one another. So, of course, you would need a new set of rules to govern this particular group, these Knights Templar. And so, the Knights received, the Templar needed a certain level of donations, received some donations and were allowed to use the king's palace in Jerusalem, and thus was born the Knights Templar. But, of course, they needed a code, and so they created the Latin Rule. The Latin Rule is a guide governing the conduct of the Knights Templar. And as you can see here, right, this is a great summary of the Latin Rule and all of its revisions. The primitive rule of the Templars was, of course, the first set of rules that they operated under. And this was the first 76 articles of their codex, right? Their rule set. And this looks very much, actually, like the Codex Astartes. So the first rule, almost a preamble, we speak, or actually the second one is even a better example. Above all things, whosoever would be a knight of Christ, choosing such holy orders, in your profession of faith, must unite pure diligence and firm perseverance, which is so worthy and so holy and is known to be so noble, that if it is persevered untainted forever, you will deserve to keep company with the martyrs who gave their souls for Jesus Christ. And in this religious order has flourished and is revitalized the order of knighthood. This knighthood despised the love of justice that constitutes its duties and did not do what it should, that is, defend the poor, widows, orphans, and churches, but strove to plunder, despoil, and kill. God works well with us and our Savior Jesus Christ. He has sent his friends from the holy city of Jerusalem to the marches of France and Burgundy, for who our salvation and the spread of the true faith does not cease, to offer their souls to God a welcome sacrifice. So it's interesting that, again, you start to see this sounds a lot more like the Codex, because it emphasizes both the devotion of the knight, but also their power, their iron will, their commitment, right? These are things that are more in line with a martial tradition as opposed to the Benedictine monks for whom humility was an absolute, the principle that governs all others. What's also interesting is, of course, the Latin rule was much more prescribed. We can see here that there are themes that appear in each of the rules. You have the 6 through 8 is the names of the fathers who attended the council. You can see here's the rule for the actual knights. You will renounce your own wills and others serving the sovereign king, right? So they required the knights to abandon their secular king and for a fixed term serve with the Templars. And your venerable brothers, that sounds something stolen straight out of the Codex Astartes, or rather the Codex Astartes has stolen this. You see, of course, how the manner in which brothers should be received. An interesting sort of, maybe not a spelled out process for inducting a new Knight Templar, but a set of principles in order to screen them. What's also interesting about the Knights Templar is their name. Their name actually comes from their original, I'm going to say headquarters, right? That's a modern term for it, was at Solomon's Temple, which is now the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And of course, being knights headquartered in a temple, they were called the Templars, the Knights Templar. One of the things I love about this Latin rule is you can see that it wasn't written in our era. We tend to organize, we'd like to have rules organized in a way that makes sense to us thematically. And we try not to put rules and regulations of different levels of importance together. So, for example, if we, in the United States, right, when we pass landmark legislation, let's say like a Voting Rights Act, then, that was its own standalone piece. And if you want to pass something else, something more trivial, you'll generally put that as its own separate legislation, or at least give it its own section. In contrast, this is sort of everything all mashed together. So look at this. There's 2 whole sections dedicated to brothers who stand too long in chapel. And here's 15. It has been made known to us, and we heard it from true witnesses, that immoderately and without restraint you hear the divine service while standing. We do not ordain that you behave in this manner, and on the contrary, we disapprove of it. But we command that the strong as well as the weak, not to avoid a fuss, should sing the psalm which is called Venite, with the invitatory and the hymn sitting down, so that their prayers in silence, softly and not loudly, so that the proclaimer does not disturb the prayers of the other brothers. This is like the email from your boss after the company party got too loud, right? That's the level of pettiness that you're seeing here. And of course, right next to it is, how they have how they should eat, and how, on communal life, right? And on giving counsel, on brothers sent overseas, right? The Knights Templar, whose exclusive purpose is the protection of pilgrims, devote as much ink to what to do when knights are sent overseas, which basically says don't do anything to embarrass us. They spend more ink on straightening out people who stand during church. It's just a really bizarre thought process that it gives us some insight into either how people thought at this time or what was seen as important at this time. It's very interesting. So what happened to the Knights Templars, right? They had this strict code of behavior. They had a papal mandate to exist, but they got one other administrative gift that would prove to earn them a ton of money, and I think is the part that makes them so much cooler than the Space Marines. Well, because they were real, so it's hard to, you can't really compare, but I will compare. And what they received is in 1139, they had a papal dictum that exempted them from obedience to local laws. This meant the Templars could pass freely through all borders and were not required to pay any taxes and answered only to the Pope. So what did this turn into in turn? Well, the Knights Templar were seen as such a trusted organization that, of course, their knights protected pilgrims going on journeys, but they were also seen as a sort of neutral knighthood, right? A neutral party that if a noble wanted to go campaign, they could put their land and other holdings entrust them to the Knights Templar, and the knights would oversee it, would administratively own that land. You also saw regular pilgrims, right? Regular pilgrims would have this incredible like proto-banking system where they would go to their local knight chapter, knight house, and they would say, hey, I'm going to be taking a journey to the Holy Land. I don't want to carry all of my valuables on horseback because it's a liability for me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give these valuables to you, the Knights Templar house, and you will give me a check for their value. And then I will conduct my pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and when I arrive in the Holy Land, I will present my check to another Knights Templar house where they will pay out funds. It's as though I've done a wire transfer, or it's a certified check. And so this was, again, like a proto-banking system, which is pretty crazy. What's even crazier is because the knights were, again, a neutral, non-state actor, that nobles could curry favor with the church and with the Pope by donating to the Templars. And so the result is that the Templars, by around the 1170s, were one of the most well-funded, well-trained, well-equipped battle forces in the Crusades. Their knights, which functionally were like heavy armor, were instrumental in some crucial victories for Crusaders. Right, the Battle of Montgessard, where 500 Templar knights helped several thousand infantry defeat Saladin's army of 26,000 soldiers. So again, you had something that felt very much like the Space Marines in the sense that they, by virtue of their access to resources and their commitment and their almost apolitical nature, let them become a decisive force on the battlefield. What's even more interesting to me is that while it was a military order, the military aspect of the Knights Templar was only a small minority of members. Most of the people that served in the Knights Templar were non-combatants. They would perform the administrative duties of the monastery, right? They would handle finances. They would run the vineyards or the farms. They would oversee logistics, right? They were an entire commercial operation unto themselves, of which engaging in military operations was only a small subset. This is one of the things that's also really interesting to me relative to the Space Marines, where the Space Marines truly treat non-Space Marines within their chapters as being tertiary at best, right? But in fact, the Knights Templar seem to treat their non-combat brethren as being equal members of the order. And, frankly, they deserve to be treated that way because without the tremendous resources that the Templars commanded, the Knights would not have been the battlefield force that they became. Now, it's worth noting that some people argue that, of course, the Knights Templar was the first multinational corporation. It was not. It was not. Corporations are modern entities driven by the need for profit with shareholders, and the Knights Templars were not that. They were a military order that also profited tremendously from their operations. So in a way, they would look more like one of those independent armies that sometimes engage in like criminal activity to fund their operations, maybe like the FARC, for example. So by the mid-12th century, of course, the Crusades had changed pretty fundamentally. The tide was starting to turn, right? Crusaders were getting forced out of the Holy Land, and the need to have this knightly order protecting the pilgrims became less essential. Again, if you don't control Jerusalem, the pilgrims don't have anywhere to journey to. And so as the Knights Templars became less and less relevant, they both received fewer and fewer donations and diminished somewhat in power. And at some point in around 1305, one of the popes decided that the Knights Templars were now more of a liability than they were an asset. And so he had them all arrested, their property seized, many of them charged with crimes falsely, and ultimately dissolved the order. So how does this, of course, inform our friends in the Codex? Well, in a lot of ways, right, the Knights Templars are much more human than the Space Marines, right, in that they had this knightly vision, but they were still subject to greed, to pettiness. They were still, of course, subject to the desire for wealth, right? And while their military skill was never really in doubt, like the Space Marines, they were equipped with the finest armor and, of course, some of the best weapons of the era. Unlike the Space Marines, they didn't last all that long in the grand history of things. They, again, were founded in around 1119 and persisted until about 1307. So you're looking at a little less than 200 years. And in that time, again, as we've seen, over that 200 years, the Latin rule went from 73 sort of governing principles, 76, to an eye-watering 686 principles. Wild. So it just goes to show, I think one of the things that's interesting is the idea of this, even a middle-aged, like in the Middle Ages, religious order, as fervent as anything in the Imperium, and as devoted in their faith as anyone in the Imperium, still, over the course of just 150 years, went from being the defenders of pilgrims to something so big and financially powerful and profitable that it looked like a multinational corporation. So guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments if you thought this sort of fun look at the real world history behind the Codex Astartes was a fun video. And if you did, let me know if there's other stuff that you want me to look into the real world history of. And thanks again for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys later.